Lingua, Gustavo. Good afternoon. This is December 10th. This is the one of my better organized with my subject matter. The topic all started about 5 years ago with my development of the psychology round and square, which I have left behind since 1974 when I got my master's in 75. It created a counseling system called 3C, which stands for communication dynamics and the communication analytica, and then the cultural spheres. It was an adaptation I have by borrowing the first visual in the use of the round spheres by Eric Burns' transactional analysis. And from that point, it was the turning point within the system, the last analytica, where I have culturally, anthropologically, maybe very unconsciously, had allowed me to returning to my roots of the Chinese and using the very basic, simple concept of the shapes of brown, meaning sky, and the square, which is the line on the earth that we can see on the horizon. And with this combination of the 3C counseling system and then the more elaborate, 50 years later, in the business, which is still very much linked to Brazil in the use of the 5 languages, Spanish, Portuguese, Italian, Chinese, English, and the Chinese and dialects. This last 50 years, business-wise, had literally contributed to the work I have returning to the field of counseling psychology. And now, if you call it, this is my personal doctoral degree, and this have moved up to the current subject matter of still the subject of conscience. But now we can talk about a consciencological future, which I have also created or coined the term consciencology. Started with Paulo Freire's Brazil with his conscientization or conscientização, and moving slightly backward to the 14th century with the Chinese thinker, philosopher, and academician, and also a magistrate in the courts, Wang Yangming. It just so happened that my father's birthplace, or the lineage of my family, is also, we share the same heritage in the village called Yuyao, present day a suburb of the city of Ningpo, along the Yangtze River Delta, and where I was born in Shanghai. So to make it, to give it to my audience, I think now we have a lot more to move on with. Now I have found the theme about conscience, and then turning into the consciencological studies, and also with the vision of a consciencological future, which also linking to a potential conscience-based, a consciencological economy. And here there are some major distinctions. I want to thank Brazil. More than that, I want to thank Brazil, thank Portugal, thank my linkage to the Luso-Portuguese culture. And within the last 5 years, more intensely this year, based on my other historical interests, to study the history of Brazil, to express part of my gratitude of my exposure and my communication and linkage, friendships, education with Brazil after all these years. And because this is also the 200th year of anniversary of the last Brazilian king emperor, Dom Pedro II, or Dom Pedro II, from the family of the Braganças. uh, from his grandfather to his relinquishing his power or overthrown by the Republicans in that period of time. The four Braganza rulers, starting with uh, João VI, John VI, who moved the entire Portuguese regime system into Brazil because of the Napoleonic threat. And he moved entire court and one of the largest library collections from Lisbon and built his new capital in Rio de Janeiro, in Rio. And also after that, his son, Dom Pedro I, who have taken Brazil into become the first empire, the Brazilian Empire, the Portuguese Empire, still under the jurisdiction of the heritage of the Portuguese. And then when he went back to help his daughters ruling of Portugal, and then his son got left behind at 6 years old. And with much of my everyday learning, including this presentation and videos, and is we are returning back to an oral history. And I was very much influenced by many of these Brazilians, historian, visual video historians. One is Paulo Razzuti, where he had found his a lot of documents or letters written by Dom Pedro, and then he had found the diary of the Dom Pedro II. By me, he was a very wise king, and with all this input and the daily listening, learning from the oral history being presented by Paulo Razzuti from São Paulo, and also another group called the Escola Caravelas of the Marcelo Andrade, with different visitors, presenters, narrators, and all the bits and pieces had reshaping my perception, my understanding, my deep respect toward the Portuguese. Of course, I lived from age 5 to 14 for 10 years in the city of Macau. At that time, I had no command of Portuguese other than the exposure from Shanghai to Macau, age 5, and then starting schooling with the Roman Catholic Salesians, with the exposure of the language. Of course, Chinese is the everyday lesson plus English. And then with the Roman Catholic Mass service, the learning of the service with Latin and the singing of the Gregorian chant. So with all these bits and pieces, as I will continue to explore, with all the more study about the youngster, the hearing, the sound, the tonal language, the multiple dialects I have in the Shanghai and the Yangtze River Delta, and then I'm using that to the southern China, the Guangdong, Hong Kong, Macau, Guangzhou, that Pearl River Delta, and plus Cantonese is my mother's native tongue. So that's become also almost I have double mother tongue from Shanghai to Macau and Hong Kong and in the area. But anyway, you will see the writing I have, which I have become accustomed using all the many AIs, Easy Online, Google, Gemini, DeepSeek, with the Chinese text, which I think they can be far more extensive and much quicker returning my request and interpretation. And of course, I use ChatGPT, but I stay pretty much with Claude from the Anthropic, okay? And every so often, I use Grok because going to the X. The freedom to use all the AI tools allow me to put a certain text and requesting another platform to give me a 4,000 characters words, so I can make that now interfacing with my pal, my buddy, my assistant from Brazil, Gustavo Melges, he's in Mariri, here I am in Wisconsin, and also creating the great adaptation into the current format in the oral presentation of history, of events, and also future events. And this is where I have, going back part of the history, thank you to Paulo Freire, who exposed to me about the conscientization, and with all his pedagogy to allow me to think about now writing also about the pedagogy of conscience, where I have found the passage of Paulo Freire's pedagogy of conscience is with his emphasis with education and all the book he has written, the pedagogy he has written. And from that of Paulo Freire from Brazil had taken me back to 14th century Wang Yang Ming in the Ming Dynasty. And from Wang Yang Ming had pushed me, sent me back further back into the 3,300 years ago of the three major thinker philosophers of Confucius, Lao Tzu from Tao, Buddha by way of India, of the Buddhist compassion. What I have found it also in the very interesting with the time, when I daring myself to starting co-writing with Claude, with the Anthropic, on the subject matter about a consciencological economy. And what is conscience? And let me go back to the very basic Chinese concept of conscience. It's just the word kindness, very well expressed by the three ancient masters and all the continuing followers, studies and books and the sutras and whatnot, but who have made a little bit of a condensation, a little bit about the confluences of all the three, plus the exposure of I Ching, which Confucius said, do not study I Ching until you're 45, or whatever silly concept. And then we found the Tai Chi of Tao. With this collective learning and simplified quite a bit by Wang Yangming when he said, your heart is rule. The way the words are used, your heart is reason, your heart is the law, or your heart is the command. So in the heart shape, in the use of the heart, what Chinese think, like psychology is written in Cantonese called Sam Lei Hao, Xin Li Shi in Mandarin. That means that you administered of your heart. And then I'm further breaking down this heart into the Western word of psychology and taking Sigmund Freud in his borrow and use of the Greek mythology or the Greek myth, the Greek history about the Oedipus complex, boy obsessed with the affection of the mother, and also invented eventually Electra complex, which the girl obsessed with the father. If I dare to take the Freudian use of the Greek examples, I would take the word psyche a little bit further into the image and the mythical personality of a nymph. The picture that I have read, well, don't forget, the way I'm using pictures and images, and very happily when I started called the Pictory Web, in the same way, we have always been taught by the many pictures, images, paintings since the Renaissance. Much of the history of the Greeks, be Plato, Socrates, and Aristotle, in the walking through the Agora, be the Raphaels and other work, we are very much easy to be influenced by pictures and images. And likewise, in most of my books and what I'm writing, the insertion with the images, again, picture tells 1,000 words. And so in this pictorial image I have about the word psyche, this Greek nymph sitting by the pond without movement of the water, and basically psyche is using that reflection from the pond, which give me two ideas of the two action within the psychology is thinking. Thinking, having reflective thinking, when like we do often looking back at the collective in history, and introspective thinking or self-learning, self-analysis. You know, this is so the psyche give me the word of thinking. And from the thinking, when I'm trying to be conducting my pedagogy of conscience, trying to make the language simpler for the people to understand, to grasp. So I coined it thinkology. In the thinkology, if I translate to my Portuguese, Italians, and Spanish, we all share the same word. In Italian, thinking is pensare. In Portuguese, is pensar. And in Spanish, es pensar. So I have pensacologia. So from English to the Romance language, and from the Romance language, I jump back to create pensacology, still using the Latin roots of pensa, a piensa, and then thinkology, pensacologia, pensacology is all about guiding us what, not what to think, but how to think, how to interpret psychology, where the conscience for the Chinese is made up of the dynamic. When one being kind is almost a natural synchronicity where goodness and fairness come from. And remember, fairness is not justice. Even in translating in Portuguese into the Roman languages, the justiça, justo, when you talk about fairness, which with the Anglo language, I found it to be a lot more accommodating, more soothing. A fairness is never about justice, but about you have to think about with sympathy, empathy, and we fair. And that's what I'm also have found that in this development of the consciencological study, it's not just the ancient Greeks or ancient Latins or Chinese, even in the most contemporary, where I have been a member of the Rotary Club, Rotary International for over 35 years. And the four-way test are basically addressing the idea of conscience. And with this kind of thing and link, the think link and the linkage, you think about the entire advocacy of Socrates. Even by drinking poison, he still never abandoned his idea, his advocacy, his critical thinking, and being constantly critical of then the small democracy in Athens. And I think what is interesting in the grasping the word conscience to have created the consciencological studies allow me to look for the East, look for the West, look at history. And from this passage of the looking for the events that can I relate to what is happening, how people use conscience and so effectively and so nicely, and yet there have not been a study like I have just framed it, coined it today, consciencology, consciencological studies that I can define better of the work and effort of Socrates, then followed by Plato's all philosophers should be kings, not about power, but be kings, have the wisdom. And that also goes into my definition today by speaking of using AI, when I have noticed in China, in Chinese, we call it man-made wisdom. And from the future readings, books, image, you shall see that I developed this cultural spheres defining the consciencological flow or the study of a consciencology or the ecology movement how we search for knowledge, how we obtain knowledge, and then transfer into the sphere of intelligence, and migrating next to the sphere, cultural sphere of conscience, and before it goes back to the sphere wisdom, before we throw it back to the general body of human knowledge. I think there will be more visuals and more new terminologies, which I'm no longer afraid to use. Even I have coined it. I have started with the Consciencology, and I have also coined this the study of a conscientization of Paulo Freire into Chinese, almost an identical expression by Wang Yangming, is to induce, to foster kind knowledge among the young people. And that's what I think with this part of the work. It's not about my method. One of Paulo Freire's methodology is his pedagogy and his focus on education. And from this general study, we have also extracted the wonderful work of Baruch Spinoza, where Spinoza has his idea about the God is nature. It's very much the Taoist. Nature is providing us with all the goods, and we have learned to respect nature and do less damage to nature. So you find another form of wisdom based with conscience of Baruch Spinoza. And even within the field, now we're going back a little bit to the consciencological, the consciencological economy, when in my 70 plus year of life, I lived in a system that every day we were told how marvelous, how wonderful our capitalism, and how also in all these past many years, how we demonized communism, socialism, and more about Karl Marx and Engels. And I have a different take. I'm not into isms. You can see every word I've said about the Buddhistic study, the Zen, instead of Zen Buddhism or Confucianism or Taoism. I think the isms can be very dangerous. In my psychology, round, square, and have the square turns become a triangle can be attacking. When we lock into this ism, then somehow we find ourselves entrapped, not being able to pull it out. So I try not to use ism because I perceive Engels and Marx's work from the reading I have from the French novels my father have always in our house. He was a graduate from Sorbonne, fluent in French, very fluent in Portuguese. But in where I learned about the Victorian era of the English, and it was a very not so kind of a society. When you talk about children, from Dickens' books, from Silas Marner to Oliver Twist, youngsters have to work hours, women have to work 10 hours. And that was the beginning of a blossoming, quote unquote, the industrial revolution of the British. Why the Europeans are celebrating the invention, creation, and give the English naval forces and their looting company called the British East India Company. I have to look at from this. Now I will even use the word diaspora. I was imagining since 1840 or before 1800s, how much China has suffered from this forced trade of opium. And don't get me wrong, after much reading, China's already been addicted with opium. And also how to perspective from this consciencological economy, also looking back, reflecting back, introspectively looking back, how our family going through this diaspora or forced to move, had to leave the country because of conflict, war, bloodshed, whatever. So in this layers of cultural spheres, when I'm talking about the glow of the Western capitalism, and then you're looking into reflectively looking back of the early colonialism, the enslavement of the Africans. But even in these terms, I have my a degree not forgiving the cruel act of the Portuguese. That thinking allowed me to think of the Portuguese and their audacity and their courage in the little country, but he was organized, structured, and this kind of organization of a country is very credible. And just not to off the subject, this organization. Look at how how the Christians under the oppression by the Roman Empire, when Rome disintegrated from their glorious looting, the grains from Egypt, product from other part of the world, and when the Germanic tribes can build can burn more fire with more fire, they can build bigger iron tools to surpass the Italians. I mean, there are many variables, but I'm just talking about the organization of the Christians had given the organization of Rome, and the linguistically carry on by the singing and the Gregorian chants, which allowed the language of Latin and its future evolution with the four basic Latino Romano language, I named it Romantina, of Italian, French, Spanish, and Portuguese. But the evolution of time, and but while I'm talking about organization and even the superstructure of the British East India Company with their own force, own troops, dominated India, repressed the Indian cotton growth, forced them to adapt to the industrialized cotton from England. We can talk all day, another hour just on the British East India Company. But just quickly to talk about, when we talk about the Western revolution, industrial revolution, I have to look back where my culture, what had happened to my people in 1840s with the Opium Wars, and then the 100 years of humiliation. I'm born in the city of Shanghai. There was a sign used to say, Chinese and dogs are not allowed in this park. I was born in the French concession, 2 blocks away from the David Sassoon's building of the Cathay Hotel, eventually the Peace Hotel. So every part of the memory is not giving me any particular pleasant, happy. Yes, in my immediate environment, I was well protected. I come from an affluent family. But to look back in history, imagine what the opium had allowed the family of Sassoon, the Iraqi Jews, had built the entire city of Shanghai. And look one more time with the American trade of the Turkish opium with the known families such as the Astors, who literally have built half of the Manhattan, and the family of Franklin Roosevelt's, the maternal side, Delano, the Russell Company, had also what they have created by the opium wealth. And here comes the interesting part. The American all know very well opium was not allowed, not in Europe, not in the Americas. And for the longest time, the China trade was hiding behind of all the opium activities that had created almost entire Ivy League universities and colleges, the Astros in Manhattan, and this story of the opium. When I'm looking at the glorification from the Industrial Revolution came the Industrial Revolution in America with all the robber barons. We're talking about oil, petroleum, highways, railroads, lights. So every time we talk about a history, what I'm doing right now is just offering you what is coming into the future. When the future industries with the incoming AI, with the spatial web, with the 6G almost ready, the acceleration of the quantico or quantum computing, and the message memory storage with all the cloud-based technology, we are coming into another industrial revolution with the economic evolution. There's no longer land-based, and also because this particular AI revolution will be also ending with the dominance of the lingua franca, no less than my writing creating a new linguistic group called Romantina in the use of Portuguese, Spanish, Italians, and French, which composing of a 1.3 billion population, plus the Chinese participating called Romancina, marrying the two. I'm basically gradually replacing Chinese English, still starting with the base. But in the future, even in this broadcast, will eventually be all in 140 languages. So knowledge is spreading. The future consciencological economy will no longer be the sort of forced trade for opium, will no longer be the hegemony with the Americans' silly, bananizing, vassalizing of entire Latin America. When I'm saying this is up and coming future opening. Because with all my years spent with Brazil, of course, the command of English have facilitated my global trade. But with what had happened, I still remember vividly 1964, the coup happened in Brazil, the overthrowing of the presidents of João Goulart with the incoming Castelo Branco. Believe it or not, that coup were not aiming at the president. That coup was the American fear of Paulo Freire, who had just started almost at the same time when the Cubans in 61, 62 managed with their alphabetization, they managed to end the illiteracy in Cuba in the use of the youth heading into the fields, work with the campesinos. Look at Cuba's educational level today. Look at the number of medical doctors they have. Look at the number of victims in Chernobyl the Cuban had helped assist and never given credit for. And so what I'm talking about, the oppressive Monroe Doctrine, just to defend the Spanish Empire once left behind, and the Portuguese Empire once left behind in Brazil, when the Tordesillas dividing by the Roman Pope Alexander VI, when Portugal and Spain owning the entire world in the oceanic turf, then come the Americans. Now, the Monroe Doctrine is to defend these two former empires, now with a bunch of republics, in turning them into the American sort of banana republic. What I feel sad about is not the crushing with all the regime change, forced change, and the massacre of the people in the Chilean coup commanded by Henry Kissinger, and the rest in Central America, the killing of the bishop, the killing of the religious, of the educational system. But what I felt sad about this oppressive Monroe Doctrine had left no real innovative thinking with imagination, with ideation of the entire Latin America, but the forced conversion of their regimes into military and be absolutely kowtowing, obedient to the American rule of force. Even today, we're at the doorsteps of Venezuela. Our president wanted to take over Greenland, wanted to turn Canada into the 51st state and take back Panama Canal, and the Gulf of Mexico will become Gulf of America. What I'm saying this, not necessarily in a accusational tone, but if we have to think and reflect, the global change is happening. The lingua franca of the English that I'm using now in the next hour can become 140 language to be shared by the respective language and the culture of the people. And I think this is a marvelous thing. That's why I'm here. In this last 5 years, I'm seeing these conversions, these changes from writing, book publishing. I have published 3 books. One book of it, Psychology Round and Square, is already in Portuguese. I can turn all of them into the 140 languages. So the technology on hand, with all this digital age that bring into us with AI, AIWI, that part of the Chinese wisdom, and I hope that will take place. Nothing about vanity that I created the term, and with any kind of financial benefits. I just hope the public will learn what can be value added with what we have acquired today. And so I will stay on this topic. In the Consciencological studies, where I have found the great credit of Wang Yangming. Wang Yangming gave me the good credit of the 3 masters 3,300 years ago. And on the right side, in the Western cultural side, I found the question mark about the invasive, intrusive, pirate-like behavior of the British East India Company, and so with the Dutch. Yes, they can rationalize. Again, they can, instead of a reason, they can rationalize, because they were totally fighting against then Spain representing the Holy Roman Empire, or representing the Pope, and the Protestant protest separating from the Papists, separating from the Rome, which is marvelous, because now that, if I allow me to think of the Protestant religious group, today we have over 45,000 Christian non-Roman Catholic groups around the world. But this is no less than what we're doing in the writing of the AI. If I don't like what the corresponding writing of AI, I can click regenerate, or I can accentuate this point. And I'm still questioning, are these all my products, or are these part of the products regenerated by AI? Of course, I can take claim this is all mine because I think AI is that with the driving. AI for me is the blind spots as a driver we never had. Now with the spatial web, I look at myself as a rubber band with multiple color rubber representing intelligence and wisdom, and it's all over my body. I have the layer. Look into another dimension. We have all the sensors. Eventually, when we are driving, when we're flying cars in China, we know there's a car on top of us at altitude. All the sensors, the sensory perceptions will be feeding us what to avoid. That means if my vehicle by the next 2 kilometers signal, I'm moving up, I'm flying up to my 20th floor residence, parking on top on the roof. I have to know all directions. So what AI have done for me had allowed me to clear those blind spots. I have my historical blind spots. Now it become a forensic study because I did not know the U.S. involvement into the 64 Brazilian coup. And only when I'm reading what the work of Paulo Freire, who unfortunately have forced exiled for 17 years, even Paulo Freire's exiles in Switzerland, and before that he was jailed for 70 days and whatnot, then exiled to Bolivia, from Bolivia to Chile, from Chile to Switzerland. And in that time of his exiles, he was asked to lecture in Harvard. And then just one other piece of information snapped into me by another colleague of mine saying, well, the empire of the U.S. still want to stall Paulo Freire not to involving with Brazil. The fear of the Americans of the size of a country like Brazil to turn into like Cuba, just because Cuba turned communist. So now you're looking back in history, it becomes the kind of study, the analysis in the open. My blind spots had opened up the 64 coup. And by extra research, I find out who was the person that was vigilant, watching over Paulo Freire before 1964 in Recife, in the northeast part of Brazil, in Pernambuco. Such vigilant minister, police, captain, colonel, the military man was Castelo Branco, who was trained in the US, who is also fluent in English. And then he was appointed to become the president of Brazil in 1964. Now, these are still basically my research in hypotheses in hypothetical order. But AI had brought me that sphere that I did not get to see. And I think this is marvelous, to be able to understand the history better, for me to be always sensitive of the glow of the glorious chance of the super capitalism and the put down of the work of Marx and Engels. And today, to see how China have advanced and how painful they were going through in that particular timing point when the Soviet Union have their sort of communistic, socialistic hegemony over all the other satellite states, including China. It's not because the enmity or the confrontation Mao had with Khrushchev, who wanted to station all the Soviet Union naval fleets in the use of Chinese ports. These are all the bits and pieces that falling out between China and Soviet Union. The pride of Mao suffering, he went through the Great Leap Forward, suffering through the Cultural Revolution, and all the many not so pleasant events, including Deng Xiaoping, who also gone through so much pain and agony during the Cultural Revolution. But as it came out, Mao and Deng had carried on their idea of a Chinese concept of socialism, communism, and not become a direct copycat of the Soviet Union. And these are the things I think AI, when we can get more information with a different sphere and different one's blind spots, that's what education is all about, is to listen to the version how the Soviet Union speak of their time, of the Chinese, and look into the conflicts. Even China had the border trouble with India, with Tibet. The Americans and the Soviet Unions were arming India. You look at the history and different sets of events, and to look at Tibet, and Dalai Lama, exile from Tibet, was funded by the CIA until 1973 when US recognized China. So all this history, all this propaganda slogan of the great success of capitalism started with the privacy of both the British East India and the Dutch East India. And imagine the little company by today's standard, had looted out in contemporary value of India 43 trillion. This is what this number and data in the AI period, in digital era, to give us all the perspectives, to allow me to talk about a Chinese cultural and civilizational renaissance, along with China's, by what China is earning or gaining in the world. Just returning China in the era before 1840 with the Opium War, when China and India, both nations was commanding 60% of then the estimated GNP, the gross domestic product of the era. China is merely returning to her old position, but this time no longer with the closed door, shut down mindsets of the Manchus or the Chinese. Because up until 1800s, 1700s, that part of the ocean never had other visitors, with the exception of India and my favorite Zen Buddhist who created the Zen sect in the study of the Buddhistic study, a very popular, very simple way to use direct influence. Almost half the Chinese was become converting to this idea of the sixth patriarch, who was an illiterate from Guangdong and who had amplified the propagation, the humanity, the kindness. Again, conscience. If I can make everyone think about the word conscience, it's being kind. Because this is, to Wang Yangming, is actionable knowledge. It's that knowledge that when you become kind, you become good, and you become also fair. If this dynamic can be introduced again to the world, to the humanity, I think this is a marvelous thing. Then you can start to read that how many conscience, very conscionable, very good projects with good conscience that also mean you have a universal benefit. You have a collective benefit. It's really that simple. But in my years living in the West, in my Now 60 years engagement with the psychology. I can go through all these names. Before that is a phrenology. And before there was Pavlov's conditional response. And from phrenology, we go into the Mesmer. We're going into this hypnotic practice. It doesn't matter. If it worked, it worked. Then we have the anxiety handling by Sigmund Freud. Then we have the walk away from Freud cultural ideas of Gustav Jung, Swiss, in his procurement, in that superego cultural of the Freud. He went off from the dimension and he was less care of the libidinal sexual bit of the Freudian psychology. Then came with Alfred Adler, change, varied, and move onward. Then we have Rollo May, we have William Maslow. And this is the time that psychology, Sigmund Freud, psychoanalysis moving into the America continent, and then with the divergence of the thinkers, philosophers, along with the psychoanalysis and psychologists. And from then Maslow, I have come to expose to the work of Viktor Frankl, totally his experience coming out of the German Nazi camp and the victims, with his development of logotherapy, a therapy of meaning. Many of the techniques, be whatever the Freudian terminologies, into the projection. And by logotherapy, Viktor Frankl, just his victims, people who suffer losses with their spouses, whatnot, and have them reverse the chair and asking them, tell your spouse, what would you like her to do or like him to do? And from that departure of the Viktor Frankl, I come into with the work of Carl Rogers, unconditional positive regards. In other words, abstain from judgment. Forget the Freudian labels. If they're catatonic, if they're schizophrenic, that takes effort for the good psychologist to abstain himself from judgment to handle unconditional positive regards. That's another element. Then I come into Eric Fromm. I don't even recall what Eric Fromm's therapeutic approach, but he was the only one in all these years had brought in an Asian and Oriental face with the work of Suzuki. He wrote his book, Zen Buddhism and Psychoanalysis, and that created another impact. Only when I come to my master's degree is 1974 at the University of Wisconsin at Platteville, when I had gone through one presentation of 2 weeks of transactional analysis. Bing! I had adopted that of the 3 sets of parent, adult, and child instead of the Freudians, superego, ego, and id. I think all this personal formatting from the idea of our teachers, of our masters, for those who instructed us, we are creating an evolution change, and by this adaptation is organic, is healthy. And from the visual arts of Eric Burns' transactional analysis, I just added the dimensionality of the round. When you and I get along, we hug, we kiss, we embrace, as we do in Brazil. And then when we are square, is that the distance? Wait a minute, I'm not sure. Maybe we have a good conversation, but a certain subject matter dynamically changing to maybe politics. And then you can say, well, I don't know, maybe he's too liberal. Maybe he's too conservative. Maybe he's a Christian evangelist. Maybe he's a Roman Catholic. We are in that puzzlement, which can turn into returning to the round, engagement, sharing, or we can turn the square into a hostile triangle. Those are the very basic ideas started in 74, 75, which I have again rekindled, restarted since COVID. So between COVID and now is the doctoral degree I was seeking in 75, 76. But again, fate, history had turned Kathy and I into a global business based in Brazil with the color gemstones, with the minerals. And we're also moving this industry from its mom and pop days to wholesale, to mining, to global distribution, and now to the digital era, from IT to AI. We are still in that business, mostly commandeering by Kathy, but we have left the university. Just simply, I had no time for the game of the bureaucracy, the game people play, fitting in very much when I started with the TA's work of Eric Burns' diagrams. So in a nutshell, in short, I'm doing today the summary, what we are moving forward, and how to my audience, I have done part of my postmaster work with the 50 years, 48 years of the business, continue with the use of the 6+ languages, and still functioning in and out the different cultural spheres. Even I can define how my business was created, formatted, and organized by me crediting the creation and formation, the organizations I was just mentioning about Portugal and the Templar Knights. The entire Templar Knights organization to the Holy Land created in France. 2 of them were ethnic Portuguese. When that order was terminated by Philip IV from France because he owed money to the Templars, their success, 80% of the Templars were not non-combatants, but all religious. Because the artifactor, using the cultural sphere, the Ottoman Empire, cut off the trade between the Venetians and also the Genoveses, that had sent eventually up to Italy. You had the Renaissance with the Medicis, with that part of the Italian Renaissance, and the age of discovery expanded from Portugal and Lisbon. And because Portugal's Inquisition did not take place in 1492, with a 50-year delay, Portugal's, with that mixture of people, of Arabs, Jewish, Christians, Arabs living in Christian land, Christian living in Arab land, the terms like Mos Árabes, Mudejeres, Conversos, converted Jews, new Christians. But there was a tolerance of these people, plus the Genovese, plus the Venetians, and the Arabics from Morocco, from the region of North Africa, and all the information of sailing, jointly developed by Henry, the navigator, the Infante, and from the house of Avis in the school of Sagres. And don't forget, Portugal was established as a nation almost 60 years before Spain got unified by the 1492, when the Reconquista or Reconquista of Granada, the city of Granada. All these bits and pieces, and I will share with you how this Consciencological studies started and what can be a Consciencological economy, meaning an economy without exploits, without exploitation, without slavery, without the abuse, by expensing others to build our wealth. Even before I finish, I want to defend a part of the Portuguese early exploration before even 1444, before they turned around, they went to the Capes. Portuguese got into Guinea, got into West Africa, already have a huge trade in gold. And then slavery did follow. And in the longer history, there were over 5-6 million of slavers. It's become a part of the economy, have brought them into the Americas. And a lot of that, not blaming, but were in the use of the Portuguese. But in my defense of the Portuguese, which is under research, at that time, in that part of history, the Portuguese population is only 1 million. Because the same question raised by many of my Brazilian friends about, was Brazil a settlement, Portuguese settlement, or a colony, which I try to defend with all bias. You have to have some bias, that the Portuguese never colonized Brazil. A couple factors. By luck, good luck, bad luck, they have not those situations like the Spanish colonization with Cortés walk in the middle of the Aztec or the Olmec Empire with their fratricidal wars. He took advantage of that, and they found immediately gold and silver, whatnot. And the same thing, Pizarro walking into the Andes, into Peruvian highland, Cusco, or in that region. They also find another fratricidal Incas. At that time, the Incas already had their roads built all the way to Argentina, not quite to the Patagonia, but trading back to the Incas history. So the Spanish walked into two regions with already established empires, wealth, and dispute. The Brazilians hit the shores of the coastal of Sao Paulo, Rio. They're finding the high plateau, which is very dense jungle in the Serra do Mar, to get up to the interior. All they have is a batch of the natives in the coastal region, which they manage to interface, to intermarry. That's what the term Mameluco is, of Arab origin. But that Mameluco, I created the term called Mamelucagem. But this Mamelucagem, we can take it backwards to the time of Lisbon, when the mixture of the culture, of the people, the tolerance of religions and faith had created Portugal a super oceanic power. And likewise, the same mixture of people, when the Portuguese Inquisition started ensuring the same work of the Spaniards, what have they done? They chased out the Iberian Jews like Baruch Spinoza, who carried with them another language called Ladino, from Latino, Ladino, one with T, one with D. And because their language, because the money, they have created Amsterdam and have taken, because the language, with what they have stolen, the navigation intelligence to the Dutch, and to also accompany the Dutch into the looting, the domination of the sugar plantation in the northeast Brazil. And from that on, when they were chased out from Brazil, Nassau, the island, Nassau, they gone into sugar, into the Caribbeans, with their unique techniques to purify the brown sugar into white powder sugar, which you can fetch more price. So this kind of language from the Brazilians' mixture of the Portuguese and the local natives intermarriage. The early part of the Brazilian colony were never about colonization. And to defend a little bit about the Portuguese use of manpower or slave trade and whatnot, the Portuguese strategic work when Vasco da Gama gone turning the Cape of Good Hope by Bartolomeu Dias and gone on to Mozambique, where they find the existing cultural traits and people from the Arabs, taking them into Calicut, India. And the Portuguese know of their strength and weakness. Their product was not receptive by the natives in the Indian coast. The Portuguese moved then on into another enclave in Malacca and eventually to Macau. And from Macau, they managed to get into Nagasaki, Japan. What the Portuguese really have done is creating, fortifying their holdings, the land holdings, their forts, to conduct trade and to monitor trade and to tax trade. And from India, they moved back to the northeast of Africa, including their stronghold in Hormuz and also by the Red Sea. So the Portuguese was already handicapped by a smaller population. And their strategy is basically holding those key points and control the trade. I'm not here to defend any of the cruelty happened in slavery, but I think it's worthwhile a cultural, psychological, and economical viewpoint of these events that we can afford today because of AI. Thank you for your attention today. I will try to make another one tomorrow. We'll continue on with the subject matter with the consciencological studies, or now the consciencological economy. Many of this presentation, I will attach images making out from Canva, the graphics. Otherwise, I will do just as much of the direct broadcasting as I do today. Thank you. ¿Costó?